This is a public awareness initiative by Columbia Asia Referral Hospital, Yeshwanthpur, a unit of Manipal Hospitals. This awareness program is regarding the latest epidemic in a pandemic, which is an acute invasive fungal sinusitis affecting quite a good number of people who have had a recent COVID infection and have come out of the infection following successful treatment. And since we are having this infection coming every day into our OPDs, presenting to multiple specialists, this particular infection needs to be treated by more than one specialty involved. So generally, the consultants who are involved in managing these patients are the ophthalmologist, a facial-maxillary surgeon, an ENT surgeon, and occasionally a neurosurgeon. So we today have tried to bring in specialists from various departments to be able to inform the lay public about the various aspects about this disease and how we go about managing such patients and what is the overall scenario in today's day. I would like to invite Dr. Rakshita, who is a microbiologist, who plays a very vital role in diagnosis of this condition, and that helps and aids in us formulating a plan of action as to how we go about managing that particular patient. Welcome, Dr. Rakshita. Most of us have heard about this condition from our MBBS days, whereas the lay public has now been introduced with a new word called as black fungus. Can you please enlighten as to what black fungus actually means? Where is it found? Is it a rare fungus in the environment? And if it is an infective organism, why is it infecting so many people now and not otherwise?
So basically, I just want to clear the air regarding this black fungus terminology. This black fungus is an entirely separate family of fungus which are called as black molds or dermatitious molds. So that this particular fungus that is now causing a havoc in the post-COVID patients is called mucormycosis, and that does not come under the black fungus family actually. Just because the discoloration of the skin becomes black, and that is why it's called as black fungus, but however it is an entirely different family of fungus, which is mucor is one and the black fungus is a separate. But the problem with this fungus currently is that it's causing so many complications in post-COVID, maybe because the way the virus is dysregulating the immune response could be one, because the spores of this fungus is present in the air in normally, like you, me, everyone over here are actually inhaling these spores on a daily basis. It's present in the air, it's present in the soil, it's present in the water as well. But there is something called a spore count, about which if you inhale more, it can cause a devastating complication, especially when the immune response by the body is very dysregulated. So these spores, when you keep probably a piece of bread outside or any food outside for a long duration of time or overnight, sometimes you do find these black spores or black fungus growing in the food. So that is nothing but this particular fungus. So inhalation of these on a daily basis will not cause any problem, but however, because of any earlier it was caused in post-transplant patients or in liver transplant, kidney transplant, or sometimes stem cell transplant. These patients, it was creating an issue. But now, because of post-COVID, we are also still learning what is the pathogenesis as to why this fungus is creating so much of an issue currently.
So, what are the tests that we generally rely upon to be able to diagnose mucormycosis?
So ideally, the samples that should be collected from the particular area that is involved, in maybe a sinus or an eye or a palate, that particular tissue should be sent for a staining called as KOH staining. That is nothing but a potassium hydroxide staining, which helps microscopically we'll be able to visualize the fungal elements in the stain. Another type of test that can also be sent is a calcofluor staining, which is extremely more sensitive in picking up these fungal elements in compared to normal microscopic examination. And the most importantly is culture. It's very important that what we see microscopically helps in aiding the clinician in making a decision whether it's mucormycosis or any other type of fungal infection. So describing the hyphae microscopically by the microbiologist as well as the pathologist is extremely important for the clinician.
So what is the role of PCR test in diagnosing?
PCR, we don't have many centers that are validating the molecular test for mucormycosis. Currently, the mainstay of diagnosis microbiologically and histopathologically would be your microscopic, your staining, KVH staining, calcofluor staining, culture and histopath. Molecular, not much.
So for the clinician, if say a patient presents to a consultant in a clinic in his OPD setting, what would you expect that he sends you as a sample? You want a tissue biopsy or would you want a swab?
Your tissue biopsy would be a highly appropriate specimen because swab sometimes can give you a false negative because it does not collect a lot of tissue on the swab, and the cotton fibers on the swab can also sometimes interfere with us interpreting the microscopic examination of the specimen. So I prefer a tissue.
Okay, thank you. Now, these patients generally are presenting to 3 departments in a hospital. They are usually presenting to either the ENT surgeon with some amount of nose block, blood-stained nasal discharge, pain around the nose, pain and swelling around the cheeks or the sinuses, numbness over the teeth, and sometimes pain over the teeth. So they will either present to the ENT department with these symptoms, or they will present to the ophthalmology department, that is the eye doctor, eye specialist with symptoms, or they will be presenting to a dental department with certain symptoms. I would now want Dr. Sangeeta Rao, who is our senior ophthalmologist here, to throw light upon what are the eye symptoms, the early symptoms and the late symptoms.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. So most of the patients who are walking into our OPD, they come with signs and symptoms of redness of the eye, swelling of the eyelid, reduced vision, difficulty in eye movements, sometimes loss of vision, and in case of late extensive involvement, they come with the eye is swollen and there is loss of vision with lot of inflamed surrounding tissue.
Dr. Sangeeta, we have been noticing quite a few patients with all the features that you have described of swelling of the eyelid, closure of the eye, not being able to see properly, the eye turning red, an occasional patient having blackness of the skin around the eye. But pain is not a major factor in these people. So, have you been seeing the same?
Yes, 1 or 2 patients who presented early, that is one of the early symptoms, severe unilateral retroorbital pain. That is a sign that we should all watch for, and so that we can pick up the fungus at the earliest. So if a patient comes, we do see post-COVID bilateral eye pain, headaches, but this is specifically unilateral headache with unilateral eye pain.
So you mean to say single-sided?
Yes.
So when you say
single-sided, one eye.
Yeah, one eye. Dr. Anjan is our facial-maxillary surgeon. So they see a different set of patients with different presentations. Dr. Anjan, can you please throw some light on the presentations to the dental department?
So, as far as dental effects of COVID, as we know that the mouth contains lots of bacteria. Now the problem is that sometimes these patients have been on antibiotics, sometimes they've been on steroids, and this changes the type of bacteria in the mouth. So the healthy bacteria, if they have been destroyed, then the mouth becomes more prone to fungal infections. So the fungal infections that we see in the jaws are probably coming from 2 sides. Either it's from the oral cavity or from the sinus growing downwards. So starting in the nose and then coming down to the sinuses. Now the signs that we see are either signs of infection of the bone or infection of the gums. So patients who previously never had gum disease suddenly start to develop bleeding from the gums, teeth starting to become loose, pain which is not of dental cause, so no decay in the teeth looking perfectly normal but still having pain. These are some of the signs that we see. The other signs that we see are in the palate. So one of the typical signs that we've seen with mucormycosis is starting of a bluish discoloration of the gums or the palate, and slowly bone getting exposed in the palate. That's one of the typical signs which we ask dentists to look out for. Now, most dentists haven't seen a case of mucormycosis in their practice before the event of COVID. But as maxillofacial surgeons, most of us have had experience of seeing 1 or 2 a year, because mucormycosis has been around for many, many years in mostly diabetics and transplants. So most dentists will refer to a maxillofacial surgeon to make a diagnosis, or to our ENT colleagues.
So, as we have gathered so much information about the various presentations in the ENT department, the ophthalmology department, and the dental department, an occasional patient who is having mucormycosis infection is presenting to the neurology department. They go directly to the neurologist because the presentation is very varied. It is not classical. All the symptoms that we have enumerated doesn't happen, and there is that subset of patients who are presenting to the neurology department. I would now request Dr. Mayank to explain with what symptoms are they presenting to his department.
So thank you for inviting me, sir. So whatever presentation we are seeing, they are more so common, as Sangeeta madam had already told, that many patients, they are coming with the unilateral retroorbital pain or the facial pain, and difficulty in this vision difficulty along with the total ophthalmoplegia. So they are not able to move the eyeballs. Some patients, they do have the focal deficits, but they are very rare. So focal deficits means sometimes if it is going inside the brain, it is encasing some artery which is supplying the major area of the brain. They may have the stroke, and they may have seizures also. But these patients, we are not seeing that frequently compared to what we are seeing, the retroorbital pain, the unilateral headache, along with the difficulty in movement of the eyeballs, the drooping of the eyelids, and the vision loss. So this is the most prominent symptoms what we are seeing in our day-to-day practice.
So early manifestations of this particular disease can actually be picked up by the patient. So let me try to summarize that if a patient in the recent past has had a COVID infection, has had admission, or has been treated in the at home by video consults or teleconsults with an occasional clinic visit, especially with steroids, then whether they have been diabetic before the COVID infection or not, they need to actually have a strict vigilance on their blood sugar levels during the treatment with steroids, immediately after the treatment with steroids, and probably monitor their sugar levels for about a month. We are seeing majority of the patients presenting to us between the 10th day and the 21st day. That means they get COVID infection on a particular day, say X day when their RT-PCR is positive. From the 10th day after that to the 21st day, we are seeing patients presenting with all the various symptoms which my other colleagues have enumerated. So if we are able to catch this infection at an early stage, then probably it won't cause as devastating a problem as it would if it has already caused blackish discoloration of the skin. Now, blackish discoloration of the skin actually happens at the last stage of the disease. That means the the fungus invades into the blood vessel, cuts off the blood supply to that region, hence it becomes black. So it is like what we in other terminology call as gangrene. That means there is no blood supply to that area, hence it becomes black. So if we are identifying somebody with the blackish discoloration, I think we are identifying those patients at a very late stage. We would ideally want to pick up these patients at a very early stage so that the treatment would be far more effective. Towards that extent, if any of these symptoms patients are presenting to our clinic, how are we going about investigating them next is the question. So what are the next set of investigations you would do? Dr. Sangeeta.
If there is a suspicion of fungus in the eye, paranasal sinuses, then we would ideally want to do a MRI with contrast, also CT scan, and then going for a debridement and tissue histopathology.
Dr. Anjan, would you differ in any which way?
No, I think that's probably correct. But from a maxillofacial point of view, I would also want to look at the bones. So MRI and CT scan look at the jawbones in different ways. MRI is much better at looking at soft tissue. Bone is better at CT scans are better at looking at bone. So I would want both a CT scan and an MRI to look at whether there is bone damage and whether there is infection in the soft tissue.
Correct. So, any of these patients who are presenting to us with symptoms which we think is highly suspicious of an acute invasive fungal sinusitis, not necessarily mucor, because there are other fungus also which can cause invasive fungal sinusitis. So, we would get a few investigations done before we know the extent of the disease process as such. So, the two imaging modalities that we are currently relying upon are MRI with contrast and a CT scan. So that gives us a wholesome picture of the disease process, its extent, what all it has involved. Why is this important? The next set of questions will probably answer that question. The eye is a very, very important organ for all of us. So this particular fungus is known to spread from the nose and sinus into the eye and from the eye into the brain. That's why it has been called as rhino orbitocerebral mucormycosis. Rhino is nose, orbital is eye, cerebral is brain. So that is the track in which it follows. So long as it is within the sinus cavity, limited within the sinuses and the bone of the palate, these people can have a good prognosis. The moment it has affected into the eye, then the prognosis drops significantly. To that extent, these investigations will help us plan the next course of action. If a patient presents to you in the ophthalmology department with, say, eye involvement, and your MRI is not showing direct invasion into the substance of the orbit, but patient has symptoms of pain and visual symptoms, how would you manage, Dr.
If it is early involvement of the eyeball can definitely be salvaged. I would prefer to give a retroorbital antifungal injection and wait and watch, along with the debridement and IV antifungal treatment, and wait and watch. In case the involvement is extensive, only then I would go for a exentration.
So now a few words have been introduced, like debridement, exentration. So these are basically what it means is if a patient has mucormycosis, and we know as we are doing surgery, we get to know which tissue is alive, which tissue is not alive. In our terminology, we would term it as vitalized tissue and non-vital tissue. So all the non-vital tissue is removed. That means all the tissue which is dead is removed. That is called debridement. We debride the whole area of non-vital tissue. That means that tissue cannot survive. It being there is only a nuisance rather than of any functional help. So mucormycosis management largely means we are trying to take out all the tissue which we think or we make a judgment on the surgical table that this is a non-vital tissue and then remove it. Now exenteration, that means we sometimes have to remove the entire eyeball because we find fungus within the eye. Because once the fungus spreads into the brain, then by and large it's a non-salvageable condition. Rarely have you seen any patient surviving this disease. Dr. Anjan, can you briefly summarize the entire protocol of treatment of a patient once he or she is admitted with mucormycosis?
So once the patient is admitted and we've got our scans, we get together, and it's a multidisciplinary decision. So the ENT surgeons, the maxillofacial surgeons, the ophthalmic surgeons, and sometimes the neurosurgeons who decide what tissue is healthy and what tissue is not healthy, what has to be removed and what can be preserved. Now the challenge is that even if you give antifungals, it only works if there is a blood supply to the tissue. If there is no blood supply, the tissue is not going to, the fungus is not going to be cured by antifungals. So we have to remove the diseased tissue. So that is done during the surgical procedure. We expose the tissues, make a decision what is vital and has a blood supply and what doesn't have a blood supply, and we remove this. After we remove the tissue, We also need to try to dress the area, try to close the wound, and at the end of the day, finally decide how are we going to make the patient normal. So there is a process of rehabilitation which is done to make the patient back to normal. Now, certain things like, for example, teeth and jaws are expendable because we can replace them. Nowadays, there are possibilities of replacing it with dental implants and a prosthesis. Some structures like the eye are not replaceable. There is no way of giving back a functional eye. But as maxillofacial surgeons, we also work with our prosthetic colleagues and also give artificial eyes as well. So the preparation for all this also has to be done during the surgery that is planned at the first stage.
Dr. Mayank, can you throw light on the medical management which would subsequently follow a surgical procedure? What would be the first choice of antifungals? Do we have alternatives in the current scenario where certain antifungals are not available in the market? How long would these people require treatment?
So, as surgery along with the medical management, it is proven to be the most beneficial first thing. So, always this surgical decision along with the medical management has to be taken hand on hand. Second thing, the treatment wise, if I will say the medicine, so we are the most traditional medicine which we were using very often in other patients who are immunosuppressed and were having other fungal infections, that is the amphotericin B, which we had about most often. So it has two varieties. One which is the liposomal, it is less nephrotoxic. Nephrotoxic means it is not harming that much to the kidney. So generally advisable is this liposomal amphotericin B, which has to be given, and IV medication has to be given. And then we have to check out the clinical as well as the imaging wise, what is the progression of the patient. Suppose patient is getting clinically stable, so then we can just repeat of the imaging after 1 or 2 weeks, and we can say that since he is not going on into the progression, we can put him on the oral medication. But if patient is deteriorating, then we can also think of starting him along with the other IV medications along with liposomal amphotericin B. So the new medications which has come into the picture are like IV posaconazole. So these are another group of antifungals which not has been recommended regularly, but if we are seeing the patient is clinically or the imaging was deteriorating, we can start with that another medications also. Now coming into the patients who are not progressing, doing well, and after imaging of 1 or 2 weeks we are seeing that patient is improving, we can put him on the oral medications. The oral medications which are available right now, so these are the posaconazole and ivosconazole. Only thing that weekly we have to go for the monitoring, serum monitoring, and we have to see the serum level. So the general advisable serum level is greater than 1 microgram per deciliter. So these things are important because day-to-day practice we can't give these posaconazole like that. So sometimes it also creates panic that patient is having headache and all. So they will start asking, once they know, they will start asking for these oral medications. So these medications have the limitations. They have some nephrotoxic effects, they has to be monitored. So it has to be given in any different clinical settings based on the clinical criteria, imaging criteria, and as per the decisions of the physicians, treating physicians. So this is the thing.
So to summarize, this particular infection has actually created so much panic because it's killing many people. It's making many people dysfunctional with certain vital organs. It's making them disfigured because there are some very important parts of the body which need to be removed. And third, it requires intensive care. It needs care as a hospitalized patient. OPD management is very difficult. Patients may need to spend time in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks at least. Once they get admitted for management, that would be surgery as well as medication. And subsequent to that, rehabilitative procedures. So taking all this into consideration, it's a huge burden on the society on multiple fronts. Manpower gets used, resources get used, there is a paucity of so much medications that we require, which is now being addressed towards only one direction. Huge financial burden on individual households who would have just come out of a major infection like COVID, and now they get into another infection. It will probably push many a family into debts, need to take loans. So the earlier this condition can actually be identified, the damage probably can be stopped. If it can be prevented, all the more better. So our efforts would probably be towards trying to find a pathway where we can probably prevent patients from getting these infections. I thank all my panelists today for having contributed their time to percolate this amount of information to the lay public. Thank you.